Hi.
Hi, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you for talking to us today. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what this place is?
Okay. I'm Richard Brown. I'm a part-time employee here at the Maryland National Capital Parks. This facility here is called the Bladensburg Waterfront Park. And we're part of the Star-Spangled Banner Trail that National Parks supports. And this goes all the way to Baltimore, up and across into the Eastern Shore. It's primarily a Maryland trail.
Okay.
And what we have here in this visitor center is we try to sort of cover the War of 1812, okay, in terms of what and in particular what happened right down the river, right up the river here, okay. Whether famous or infamous, the Battle of Bladensburg took place within sight of where we are right now. You would have, matter of fact, you wouldn't want to be standing here unless you were a soldier.
Yeah.
Okay, you want to be standing here because the battle would be taking place and musket balls would be probably flying. So.
Did they have spectators? I know Civil War had more spectators for a while.
No, this war did not have spectators, except people may have, you see, the British came right down what we call Bladensburg Road. Well, it's now called Annapolis Road.
Annapolis Road.
Okay. They came down Annapolis Road and sort of spread out a little bit throughout the town. So now the British, you know, acted in a civil manner at times and in an uncivil manner at other times. Basically, coming through Bladensburg, they didn't destroy Bladensburg. They didn't, you know, they didn't loot or do anything of that nature. Okay, they were very disciplined in this respect. But when they, now Lowndes Hill, if you look up Annapolis Road, you can see it goes uphill, and that was referred to Lowndes Hill after Lowndes, who was basically the founder of Bladensburg about 1842. He laid it out as a town and sold lots and so forth, and it became, this was a major port.
Okay.
Okay. This river, even though if you look out right now, is at low tide, and you see the mud flaps, 200 years ago, this was 40 feet deep.
Oh, wow.
And ships came up here. This was a major tobacco port and an inspection port for Maryland for tobacco. And the reason it was so important was because it was so far inland, and it allowed the planters and the plantations to bring their tobacco here rather than all the way to either Annapolis or to Georgetown. And this was established, this port was established before Georgetown was.
Now, that's interesting, because when I first arrived today, we were looking, me and my producer were looking at the actual river out here, and it seemed so low, we were like, how, you know, this didn't seem like a
well, it was a major port up until around 1820. Now, there are reports, there's a good paper written by the Maritime History of Bladensburg, written by the State Highway Administration, okay, which purports that this port, probably before 1820, was beginning to silt in, and ships with lower draft, with a shallower draft, were making it up here. But prior to the 1800s, ships with deep draft were making it up here. But once you started the plantation system and also the living, people were cutting the trees down for lumber to build and also to clear the land for planting. Once that happened, it was all over.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So, well, we're here today to start off about the War of 1812, and I know it's a bigger topic, but could you give us a
succinct account of
yes,
what? Okay.
Please.
By 1812, the Americans had suffered losses of probably between 5,000 and 6,000 men being taken off their ships, okay, and pressed into the British Navy. Britain was at war with France, had a navy of 130,000, needed at least 20,000 men a year to replace those that they lost.
Was any of that kind of revenge for the fact that we helped, or the French helped us, so they were kind of
yes,
taken?
so the British had not gotten over the loss of the colonies by any means, and had most British military and naval people had a real antipathy towards Americans, okay, and also resented the competition that we were producing in commerce, okay. the blood life of the new colonies was naval commerce. Okay. And we engaged with France, and we in the Caribbean, the sugar trade. All these things played part into this. But by 1812, we had lost a lot of men. But also, we had this idea, manifest destiny. You know, we just got the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and so now, and Jefferson, who had avoided war, but Madison, who was his protege, okay, was also against war. But by July of 1812. He decided that it was too much, and we had people like Clay, who were really war hawks and so forth, and basically they prevailed. You know, they began this patriotic sentiment, and they thought that they could just march into Canada, and the Canadians would join us. They would become the next colony, okay? And mistakenly, I guess they forgot that all the loyalists went to Canada. So that didn't work out. As a matter of fact, as a result of going into Canada and burning their capital, then we were chased out. Yeah, we burned their capital. We went into Canada and we thought that they would join us. Well, we burned their capital and basically pillaged the city in our retreat. The Canadian militia are the ones who kicked us out of Canada. Okay, and they kicked our regulars. Our regular soldiers were in Canada. We didn't have hardly any regulars in this area. We had some, but not very many. I think we only had an army, maybe about 10,000 at that point.
Okay.
And most of them were engaged in Canada. They forced the Americans to retreat and took Detroit, along with Tecumseh and his Indians, okay, took Detroit and occupied Detroit for the remainder of the war. Huh. Okay. Now, we were very successful on the lakes, Lake Champlain and Lake Erie, our naval battles, we were very successful there. But getting back to the beginning of the war. Once, also, there was New England almost seceded as a result of our declaration of war.
Really?
Yeah, because their life depended on commerce. They had deals with England. They worked it through. You know, when there's a will, there's a way. Yeah. So they were very, very upset with the idea that we had declared war. But the South was supported it, and Maryland supported it. When some Federalists opposed it in Baltimore, a newspaper editor in Baltimore, he was severely beaten. And one of his friends who came to his support and to help him was General Light Horse Lee. Okay. Okay, who was famous from the American Revolution. Okay, he was a hero of the Revolution. They beat him so bad that he eventually died from his wounds, okay? And this was the people who were for the war. Yeah. And the reason they were for the war in Baltimore, because Baltimore was basically a hub of commerce, and they were being stymied by the British, and they were being stopped and taken. So Baltimore was very much pro-war. And of course, subsequently, Baltimore was the nest of pirates, as the British referred to them, because the privateers, they had so many privateers coming out of Baltimore. And the most famous one was, offhand, I can't remember the name of the ship, but they ended up calling it the Pride of Baltimore, and that's where the Pride of Baltimore comes from. It was a privateer. It was very, very successful. And Barney, who is one of our main characters, was also very successful in the privateer Rossi. And
he was, I believe, he got the first letter of marque.
He may have. I'm not sure of that. Okay. But they were. I mean, he was an entrepreneurial character as well as being a patriot. He was really a very, very unusual character. Okay, but he earned about $1.5 million for his sponsors.
Is that? And
that was shared.
Clarify, is that $1.5 million back in 1800s?
Yes, back in 1800s.
So that's without inflation.
That's without inflation.
Wow.
Yeah, okay. And that's the ships that he brought in and were sold, and the cargoes that were sold. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a very profitable business. You know, venture capitalism is nothing new. Yeah.
So okay, so. And we'll actually, I'm going to ask you about Joshua Barney in a few seconds. Okay. So we got into the war for a couple of different reasons. Yeah. And then...
now, we didn't have a Navy and we didn't have an Army when we declared war, just so you know.
And 10,000, that was 10,000 for the whole Army.
Yeah, the whole United States.
That's not a lot of people.
Which include Louisiana Purchase.
Wow. So where did we go from there? We declared war. We didn't have an army. We didn't have a navy.
What we did, you see, in declaring war, what we did is we did the Canadian thing.
Okay.
Okay. But by February of 1813, the British sent a small fleet, maybe about 20-some ships, basically to try and control the privateers.
Okay.
Okay. The privateers during the privateers took around, and this, I'm not, don't quote me on this, but all these figures get thrown out, but I think it's around 1,500 prize ships.
Wow.
Okay, and
those were all British.
Those were all British, right? Yeah, the French we didn't bother with, although the French were not necessarily all that friendly with us at that time either, and that's just another story that just takes us too long to get into. Okay, so there was a real intent on the British part to stop the privateers. Okay, privateers were faster than anything that the British. They were faster. They were sloops more or less, and they were just so much faster. Frigate couldn't, you know, and they could outrun a frigate, which was much heavier, had about 36 guns, and you know, it just didn't fly the way you know, the Pride of Baltimore does.
Yeah,
okay.
and I would assume frigates are heavier, so they
much heavier.
The sloops and the were able to get into places where the frigates could not.
Yeah, well, yeah, the frigates. There were a lot of places frigates had to stand off because of the depth of the water, right? But they did have other ships. The British had sloop of war and brigs, which were shallower draft. Okay, didn't need as much water. Well, by 1813, the British had sent a fleet in here. Okay, and what they did is their orders were, and this was a direct connection with what had happened in Canada. Okay, orders were if a town or a village offered you any resistance, then you were to burn it and loot it. If they did not, then you were to pay for what you took, and you were to treat the citizens fairly. That happened, and it didn't happen, because initially they attacked Norfolk. Norfolk was well defended and had good tactics, and what the British would do in the bay is that they would use their frigates as basically gun platforms, and then they would send barges out with Marines and sailors to go into the towns and to procure, because they had about, I think it was close to about 20,000 men just here in terms of sailors and Marines and so forth. So they had to feed them. Okay. Right. So their first attempt was to take Norfolk. Why? Because it was a shipbuilding area and they wanted to destroy that. They failed. But if you know the bay, right up across the James River up is Hampton. Okay. Hampton was not defended. And unfortunately, they had French chasseurs with them, which were French soldiers serving for the British. Well, they basically looted and raped and murdered people in Hampton. So this sent fear. I mean, this just frightened the whole of the bay. As this news came out, you know, this is what the British would do. Well, the British were upset about this too, because they didn't. These were against the orders, and they withdrew the French troops, and they never used them again. Okay. But it was very devastating to Hampton. Primarily, they came up the bay, and wherever they needed food and so forth, they would just take it. They would pay for it. I don't know if it was at the proper rate or whatever, but they would, okay. And the other thing they did is when they would go into the plantations, they would take the slaves, they would offer the slaves freedom if they came with them. Because not that they were great abolitionists, but they were trying to undermine the economy of the region, which was successful. About 2,000 slaves withdrew with the British eventually, and they recruited a troop, what they was referred to as the Colonial Legion, and also sometimes referred to as the Ethiopian Regiment. Now, they weren't a regiment, but it would have been a brigade of 300 men who fought for the British. They actually fought for the British here at Bladensburg. Really? Okay, these were black troops. And they used to love to send them into the plantations because it scared them. The plantation owners this was their greatest fear,
right?
Okay, that the slaves would uproot. And if you read any of the history, what was so incredibly important was to make sure that slaves never had this idea in their mind, okay?
Right.
So here come these uniformed, disciplined black soldiers into plantations, and it really scared the planters more than anything.
Now, out of curiosity, what happened to these soldiers after the war?
The soldiers were based on Tangier Island, and that was where they were based. And then they would go. Then they would go with the ships and go wherever. But when the British left, that unit went with them and fought for them in the Caribbean,
okay,
and eventually settled in Trinidad. Now the 2,000, slaves who did not join sort of the military, which were men and women and children, they were transported to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Okay. Now in Halifax, Nova Scotia, there had been, the Huguenots had been moved from there to New Orleans. Okay, so there were these empty lots and farms. So they thought that they would settle the freed blacks there. Well, what ended up happening was they never got the land. Some people got some land. Okay. They established some towns, but basically they became a pool of cheap labor. Okay. Now I've been to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I looked up the African American Cultural Society, African Canadian Cultural Center, went there and found out some very interesting things. That basically their situation was never very good. The schools were poor. The towns where they were didn't have public water, paved streets, electricity. I mean, they didn't get those improvements till 1970.
Wow.
Okay.
So wait, 1970.
Yeah, 1970. So wow. it was a really, and still today it's an issue. I mean, yeah. So they left slavery and they were free, but.
Okay. So we were fighting. We fought, and how did the war end? Well,
the war ended. The war ended with the failure of them to take Baltimore. That's really where it ended in September. I think it's September 18th. When they defeated Napoleon, it freed up the British Army and Navy. Okay. So then they sent 30 more ships into the bay. With the idea of really trouncing the Americans. Now, they only sent about 5,000 soldiers, and they were a variety of regiments. There was the British, the 85th, the 45th, or the 44th, the 4th, the 29th, 22nd. These were regiments that formed up this army, But they were all veterans. They were veterans of the Peninsular War, and these guys knew how to fight. And when we talk a little bit about the Battle of Bladensburg, some of the difference between militia and veterans is just, the difference is just incredible, in terms of their ability to carry, fight a battle. The British then send General Ross in charge of this unit. They wanted Wellington, The Crown asked Wellington to go, and Wellington said, no, thank you. I don't see this as being something I want to be engaged in. So they sent Ross, Major General Ross, who at that time had been injured in the Peninsular War. He thought he was going to go home to recuperate. They send him here instead. Here is a very competent British officer, a strange man because he's beloved by his men. This is such an unusual character. I mean, he is well liked by his men. For a British general, that's unusual. Now, Wellington certainly endeared himself to his men as well. But he comes here, and the purpose strictly is, now there was some discussion as whether they should attack Washington or not. But Cockburn, and Coburn, and Coburn was the admiral in charge of it. He had lost a brother at Yorktown, or I've heard a brother, then I've heard a cousin at Yorktown. he hated the Americans, okay? And he really, this is one of the payback. So basically his statement was simply that we're going to burn Washington as a result of because what the Americans did at York. Okay. So you know what payback is. It's not very nice. So they landed in what is called Benedict, which is right there on the Patuxent. Okay. This is a good map right here, okay? And they marched, it took them 3 days. They marched from there to Lower Marlborough, to Nottingham, to Upper Marlborough, and then to Bladensburg. They got to Bladensburg around maybe around 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Now this is after, in August. This is August in Maryland. And George Gleig, one of the characters from the 85th, he's a second lieutenant, talks about the heat in Maryland. It was different because he had been fighting in Spain. There it was dry heat. Here he comes and gets this heat, and it's so damp, and these guys are dressed in their uniform with wool, their tight collars, and men are falling out left and right. There's a lot of stragglers, okay? And this was not unusual in hot situations, or not unusual at all. And they get to Bladensburg, and there is 5,000 militia opposing them. Well, unfortunately, those 5,000 men had been marching back and forth because General Widner, who was a cousin to the governor, he didn't know anything about leading men, okay? It was a political appointment. Right. And so he had heard, oh, they're here, oh, they're there. And so he moves his men. By the time they finally settled in Bladensburg, his men were exhausted, okay? Not only that, when he set up the defensive line, he set it on the other side of the bridge, okay? So they didn't burn the bridge, you know? And so, I mean, the military mistakes are, you know, and George Gleig talks about that, you know, if they had this and if they had done that, and, you know, and so forth. And this is from the British perspective, okay? Yeah. They get here, and Ross is basically in a house called the Parthenon, which no longer exists, but it was on Lowndes Hill, and he could see where the Americans were settled. Also, part of Monroe came to the battleground. Oh, I mean, Madison did, and so did Monroe, who was Secretary of Defense. No, that was Armstrong. But Monroe is Secretary of State or something. I don't know. He's one of the, and he moves the second line of defense, which was 50 yards from the first line. He moves it a half mile back. And that's the end of the battle. Yeah. And not only that, when the British attacked, when they first attacked over the bridge, the Americans fired on them and forced them to retreat. But don't forget, these were soldiers who would walk over dead bodies, okay? Yeah. This was not something new to them. But they also had something that really scared the Americans, and that was the Congreve rocket.
Oh, I heard, yeah. If you could talk about that. Then.
Yeah, the British had only 3 cannons, okay? And most of those cannons, up until they got to Upper Marlborough, were pulled by sailors. Then they basically got horses, and they pulled them by horses. And so, but when they got here, they only had 2 3-pounders. Now, a 3-pound ball is 2.7 inches. It's about like that. And 1 6-pounder, which is about 3 inches. Okay, these are very small cannons. Yeah. They're not going to do a whole lot of damage.
Not what you think about when you think about.
Right, when you think about a 12-pounder, which is about like this, or grape shot that you're going to shoot out of that. But grape shot out of a 6-pounder isn't going to be very much either. Right. But what they had was Congreve rockets. Now, Congreve rockets, you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with a Congreve rocket. You couldn't aim it anywhere. But what it did was so random that it scared the militias who were poorly trained, poorly led, and had really never been in battle before. Okay, so here come these rockets. They're making this whistling sound, okay? And they're coming down, and you don't know where they're going to land. Okay, so they land here, they land there, and when they explode, they kill you. Okay, they do kill you. I mean, they're effective in that respect, okay? And so the Americans, once the British started employing the Congreve rockets, the Americans began to, and once Americans have fired their first round, okay, and the British now proceed forward with vehemence, the Americans run, okay? And they ran what is called Bunker Hill Road. They headed, now a lot of the militia were Baltimore militia. So they were out of their home grounds, okay? Okay. And we know what happened when they got to Baltimore and the British got to Baltimore. That was a different story. That same militia scared the British to death. Okay, I mean, if it didn't scare them, it gave them second thoughts to the point that they retreated and left North Point. But that's another story. Okay, so they get here and they get to the second line, of course, and they're still firing these. Now, they just captured the cannons that the Americans were originally using that did stop them at the bridge. They've captured these cannons, they've turned them around, and now they're firing at the Americans. Now they've got artillery, okay? So they get to the second line dissolves as well. Now, they proceed up Bladensburg Road, and Bladensburg Road hasn't changed any since 200 years ago. It's the same road, okay? They're coming up the hill, and who's at the top of the hill? This absolutely audacious, bold guy by the name of Joshua Barney, who's around 55 at this point, okay? He was born in 1759. So here's, you know, and so he has brought his sailors and Marines from St. Leonard's Creek, because what he was able to do, he had a fleet of barges. These barges were between 50 and 75 feet long. And he had been attacking the British just continuously, you know, with these barges and carronades. That's all they had was one cannon in the front. But this cannon was also a heavy bore, short range, heavy bore, which would, if it hit the side of it, it would put a hole in it. Okay. So he's been fighting this fight with the British. The British know him. They know who he is, okay? And finally, they box him up in St. Leonard's Creek, and he realizes that he can't get out of this situation because they blocked it. So he burns his ships and then hauls the cannons all the way from down there, all the way up to here, all the way to Bladensburg. Okay. And he sets himself up at the top of a hill. Okay. It's now Eastern Avenue. It's what is called Eastern Avenue. Just about there, maybe a little bit closer into Maryland. He sets his cannon up with his Marines and sailors. Now, these guys, some of them, I mean, these are sailors who know how to fire guns, okay?
They're not militia.
They're not militia. They're not militia. These guys, and they devastate the British, okay? According to George Gleig, Second Lieutenant George Gleig of the 85th, the English lost, I mean, the British lost 300 men, okay? The Americans only lost about 26.
That's it?
Yeah, that's it. Okay, so and what happened once the British were shocked, so shocked by this, they retreated. Okay, not only did he fire the cannons up, but then he charged the British. He only had 500 men. Okay, so they withdrew, but on his flanks there was militia guarding him, and they withheld for a while. But don't forget, these were trained, experienced troops. They persisted, and that was enough to make them flee. And once they fled, what happened? Barney. The wagon with his supplies fled with the militia.
Oh, man.
So there went his ammunition. So he told his men, retreat. Now they didn't run, they retreated. And he had been wounded. He had a ball in the thigh. So he couldn't move anywhere. And Charles Ball stayed with him, and so did another Marine. But everybody else retreated. When the British get to him, okay, they know who he is. Okay, and one of the sergeants reports, you know, this is Joshua Barney. And so Ross and Cockburn come over to him, and they parole him on the spot.
On the spot.
Okay. Now, paroling was a form of releasing a prisoner to the promise of a parole. So you gave the French word parole means you give your word not to fight anymore until you're exchanged for someone of equal rank. That's the term. Barney was paroled in Philadelphia during the Revolution, and he couldn't fight for a year because the Americans hadn't captured anybody worth his rank. And then he got another lieutenant. Finally, when they captured the lieutenant, they exchanged him. Then he could go back to fighting. But he was in Philadelphia. You know, there was nothing stopping him. But he'd given his word, and that was basically the gentleman's way of doing things. Okay. So Joshua Barney is paroled on the spot. And commended by General Ross, you know, saying that if the rest of the soldiers had been what his troop was, they would have lost the battle. It was clear, he said, we would have lost. Okay.
And this all from 500 people?
500, yeah, 500 troops, yeah.
And how many, I don't remember if you said this, how many British troops were attacking?
About 4,000.
About 4,000.
Yeah, about 4,000. And here again, George Gleig reports, maybe 4,500 if you count the commissary, the medics, and all those other sort of ancillary people
But
in
the
the
size
market.
of much larger force.
Well, yes, when they met
500
Barney,
versus
yes.
4,
Yeah,
yeah.
but initially it was 5,000 against 4,000.
But those were militiamen.
Those
so
were
they
militia, that's right.
scooted out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
interesting. Okay, so and then you said that after the British's defeat at Baltimore,
They basically, that was the end of the, I mean, I'm sure, I don't have any, I'm not sure, I'm sure that they did other predations to towns and so forth.
Right.
But basically by November, October, November, they were out of the bay.
Okay.
Now, the war itself, the treaty was over a year that Adams and other members of the government were in Ghent, which was in the Netherlands at that time. Belgium didn't exist yet. We're basically working on a peace treaty with Great Britain. Now, the British are, the British would sign anything, and then just ignore it. Okay, that was tradition with the British. Okay, but with their failure to take Baltimore, okay, that stiffened the American position and gave them some credence in terms of dealing with the British. The British and the Americans signed a peace treaty on December 24th, 1814.
Okay.
Okay. And that peace treaty basically set everything back to where it normally was. Now, another piece of irony that I just discovered was the impressment of American seamen, the British Parliament passed a law stopping that practice before the war was declared.
So the reason we got into the war,
that's right, because one of the main reasons,
right before the war started.
And the British passed a law saying this practice can no longer be condoned. We won't do this anymore.
Okay.
But we didn't know that because it took 2 months, for a ship to get across.
Yeah, there was no phones and stuff around that.
Yeah, a ship had to go across the Atlantic, and maybe 40 days was the fastest you could make it. Okay.
And it's kind of interesting to think about how stuff could have been prevented if there was better
communications.
Communication.
Well, the other thing is that the same troop, the same troops that withdrew, and Colonel Brooke was in charge of the withdrawal from North Point. Okay. I think he was the colonel from the 44th Regiment, and there was the 44th, the 85th, and all those other different regiments, but he was a senior officer, and it was his decision not to attack Baltimore. Okay. When they went up to Baltimore and they saw what was waiting for them, the whole population was armed and in a defensive position, they would have been wiped out.
Yeah.
So they withdrew because he also knew that their next assignment was New Orleans.
And then there's the Battle of New Orleans.
And then you have the Battle of New Orleans, where half of that force was wiped out. Wow. Over 2,000 of the British were lost, and maybe 70 Americans were lost at the Battle of New Orleans.
Wow, that's a big
it was
difference.
Incredible. And that just sealed, the American position and so forth. But the irony of it all is that all the borders, whether it was Canada and Maine and so forth, and all went back to where they were.
So nothing was gained, nothing was really
lost. What was lost was the Indians lost. Okay. If you ask who lost that war, it was the Indians.
Okay.
Because they were the ones who supported and participated with the British in hopes of stopping the Americans expanding westward.
Okay.
Okay. Well, Tecumseh was killed, and he was the leader of this confederation that went all the way from the Carolinas all the way to Michigan and so forth.
Right.
And from that point on, what Andrew Jackson did to the Indians.
Yeah.
Okay? The Trail of Tears and so forth, and he disappropriated the Indians in a big way, and that was payback. But even at the Battle of New Orleans, the British had tried to recruit Chickasaw Indians, and they said no. But first of all, because they knew that the British would not protect them. Right. They knew that they were in a very vulnerable spot. So
now, talking about that with as you said about Andrew Jackson and the repercussions of the War of 1812, when I was in school, the War of 1812 was like if I remember correctly, there was a big unit on the Revolutionary War, a big unit on the Civil War, and then a little unit on everything that happened in between, including the War of 1812, and it was a couple paragraphs, and we had a fight with the British. But from actually delving in and learning things about the War of 1812, it seems like it's actually more, it should get more recognition than it actually does.
Yeah, and part of the reason it should is the fact that for the first time, I think we felt we were a nation. Despite New England's trepidation about the war, we did come together as a country. We got a national anthem. I mean, and that's a very heroic national anthem.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the reason we got the national anthem is because Dr. Bean arrested as the British were coming back down. The British followed the same route back down to Benedict, and there were always stragglers. And Bean arrested them as they started to try. He arrested them, and one of them escaped and got back to the ship and said, "Look, this guy just took all our men." So the British went back and arrested Bean and took him on the tonnage, which was the ship, and then Francis Scott Key went out there to and this was Cochrane that they were trying to negotiate with. He said, "I'll let you go, but after the battle, because if not, you know what we're doing." And so,
yeah.
So that's sort of a little bit, but the Star Spangled Banner came out of that.
Interesting. Okay, so you talked about Joshua Barney, and that's actually one of the reasons we came here is because we're really searching out information on Joshua Barney because we started in Fells Point and we had heard about Joshua Barney, and he sounded like an interesting fellow, but I had never heard about him until I started working on this. And all these little informations are coming out, like what you told me about the Battle of Bladensburg, and it's just amazing some of the things he did. Why don't we know more about Joshua Barney, and why should we know more about Joshua Barney?
Well, he was a hero both of the Revolution and of the War of 1812. We don't hear about him the Revolution. He was on the Andrea Doria, which was the first ship to receive a salute as a colonial ship of the new nation of America, the United States, receives a salute from the Dutch Antilles, okay? And he was aboard that ship he was a master mate, I think, on board that ship. Subsequent to that, he was on the Wasp and the Hornet, which were sloops of war, and his actions in the Delaware Bay against the British earned him a rank of lieutenant at the age of 16. Men waited till they were 30 back in those days before they could become lieutenants.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you can't even imagine somebody 16 nowadays doing, being in battle at all, but he was a lieutenant at 16.
Well, imagine this. Imagine being 15-year-olds. Think of yourself at 15 or whatever, and being on the ocean and being a ship's master, not a master, but being a master mate on a ship at 15. So that means you were in charge of all the men, okay? And your captain dies. So all of a sudden, at 15, you are now the captain of a sailing ship. And if you read any accounts of sailing ships, I mean, this required a great deal of skill. Not only that, not only soon does the captain die, then you are hit with a really nasty storm that tears your ship up and ruins your spars and tears your sails, and you limp into Gibraltar. Now, you're only 15 years old. And so what you do is you act like a captain. You go into port and you ask them to survey your ship. And now this is in 1775, January 1775. So we're not at war yet. So you ask them to survey your ship and see whether or not it's repairable. He gets a report back, it's repairable. Now, he's 15 years old. How do I get this repaired? He goes and negotiates with an English company to forward him 8,000 pounds to get his ship. Here they give this to this 15-year-old. He gets his ship repaired. He still has his cargo on board. And now he has to go to Nice, France with this cargo, okay? He gets to now, the guy who forwarded him the money, one of the partners, goes with him, just because he's 15. Right. He needs some adult supervision, okay? So he gets to Nice, France, and now Nice is under the control of the King of Sardinia, if you understand where Sardinia is and where Nice, anyhow. So he gets there, and the merchants at Nice all of a sudden realize he is a minor. We don't have to honor this contract.
Oh,
but you have a contract and this is our stuff. So they start to take it off his ship. They open the holds and start taking, well, he at night shuts it and says, you can't take this. And they said, oh yeah, we can. And they arrest him. So he's just a 15-year-old. So the governor says, look, if you behave yourself, and don't cause us any trouble, we'll let you out of jail. Barney says, okay, I'll be a good boy. So he gets back on the ship. He closes his hatches again, and this time he hoists the British pennant. Okay, now he's created an international incident. I mean, he's a smart guy. He understood maritime law. He understood all these things. So now the governor forces him to leave and continues to take, but he goes on a British ship, and along with this British character, and they said, okay, you need to go to the governor. You need to go to the consul in Milan. Now, if you know France, Nice is here, and then you have the Alps, then you have Milan, Italy over here. So he's going over, and he gets on a mule, and they make this trip over the Alps to the consul. The British consul is enraged because now they've offended British territory. He sends a message to the governor. He says, you're going to honor this contract, blah, blah, blah. He gets back there, and the governor's hat in hand. How can we help you? Okay. This is a 15-year-old. Okay. They pay him his cargo, and then he says, well, I need a cargo. So I'm going to go back to Spain and pick up a cargo in Alicante, Spain. He gets there, and all these ships in the bay. He said, what's going on? And all of a sudden, Charles, King of Spain, says, we need your ship. We're going to attack the Bay of Algiers, and we need your ship to carry the mercenaries over there. He says, okay. I mean, there's nothing he can do. Right. So he does. The invasion of Algiers fails terribly because too many people knew what was going on. Well, it had just been commandeered by the King of Spain. Subsequently, after that, he's allowed to take a cargo and goes back to Baltimore and tells his story to the owner of the ship, who is just absolutely incredible, hard to believe. And but then he puts him in charge of another ship. This is at the age of 15. At the age of 15. At the age of 15. Now, the Americans are at war. By the time he gets back, he gets stopped by a British ship, and all the weapons on board ship are taken off of his merchantman. Okay. Which begins a sort of a lifelong anger and antipathy towards the British on Barney's part, who...
Though from what you were saying about the Battle of, actually, I don't know if you mentioned that yet. Could you talk about how he was a gentleman? That was, you were talking about that before. Even though he had this animosity,
yes,
he
was captured 3 times, okay, and imprisoned by the British. Once he was paroled in Baltimore. The other time he was taken with his crew all the way to Portsmouth, England, and placed in prison in Portsmouth, England. That time he was treated very, very poorly. The very first time when he was paroled, I'm not sure which came first, but the time he was paroled, he was treated very fairly by the captain. He was actually treated like an officer, as was the custom. If you captured another officer, he was given officers' quarters, and he basically ate with the officers. Huh. That was tradition. Okay, that was custom. So he was treated well in one case and treated very poorly. He was actually forced to stay on deck the whole trip, okay, when he was captured in the Atlantic, and forced to stay on board deck the whole time. When he came off the ship, the British, who were so shamefaced by what they saw, the treatment, they had to carry the sailors out of the hull because they were so weak and anyhow. So they end up in Portsmouth prison, okay. His story is, his escape from Portsmouth prison is just a story in itself. And I don't know if we can get into that. But when he, in another situation, at the end of the revolution, he is in a battle with a ship called the General Monk, which had been the General Washington, had been taken by the British, renamed the General Monk, and had been blockading the Delaware Bay. Barney is hired by the Pennsylvania legislature, okay, to protect a flotilla of merchantmen and get them out into the Atlantic so that they could then disperse and sell their wares wherever they wanted to. And so, I mean, because commerce was the lifeblood of port cities like Philadelphia and Boston and other places. They attempt to leave Delaware Bay. If you see Delaware Bay, it's sort of shaped like this and then closes a little bit. And the British were blockading this entrance, okay?
Okay.
What he does is he orders the flotilla of merchantmen back up the river. And then what he does is he draws, there's a brig, a sloop of war, and the brig is the General Monk, and a frigate. Now the frigate, it's too shallow for a frigate to get up here, okay? Okay. He has to come up at the right tide, and they don't know the bay, and there's shoals all over the bay, okay? He engages, he makes believe he's going to run, which sort of draws in this brig to chase him, the General Monk, to chase him. Now the General Monk is armed with about 20-some cannon, 9-pounders. Now he has on his little ship the Hyder Ali, which was named after an Algerian freedom fighter. Okay. The Americans recognized that this guy was a kindred spirit, and so they named the ship after him. So he's on this ship, the Hyder Ali, which has only has fewer guns, about 16, and they're only 6-pounders. He draws this guy in, and then what he does is he turns on him. Now he's only been on the ship for 2 days, so he doesn't not know how this ship is going to handle, but he takes a gamble on it. He brings it and he opens fire on this ship. The ship returns fire. What he does is he comes back and comes alongside the ship, okay, and he gives, what he tells his men, this is a counter order, pass that around. And what he does is he yells clear, because he's close enough to the General Monk, so the General Monk can hear his orders. And he yells out, hard a port! And so the General Monk realizes he's going to try and escape to the left, so he turns to the left, and then what the Hyder Ali does is go hard starboard, and he catches in the rigging in the bowsprit and locks onto the General Monk, and then begins to this devastating fire across the deck and basically decimates the ship. The captain of that ship is wounded. His officers are killed. It was really devastating for the General Monk. He brings the prize ship. Now, prize ship is a ship you capture. It's called a prize ship. Right. Brings it into Baltimore and makes sure that the captain is carried off, and basically makes sure he's taken to the house of a Quaker lady to take care of him. And he goes to visit him and so forth. And he's very, you know, he treats him like a gentleman and so forth. So he's a very honorable man. If you treat Barney well, he will treat you well as also, okay? And at no time am I aware that he did anything that was dishonorable, okay?
We get to the War of 1812, and you talked about the Battle of Bladensburg, but is there more with Barney in the War of 1812?
Barney's involvement with the War of 1812 ends with the Battle of Bladensburg. Okay. Okay. He subsequently goes back to Baltimore and then goes to Pittsburgh, and his family goes with him, and they decide they're going to purchase some land in Kentucky. They get on and this is about 4 years later, he's accumulated, at this point I don't know how much he has in terms of funds, but he had accumulated. At different times, he was well-to-do, and then he would lose it. Okay, in commerce, generally speaking. Okay,
it can happen. Yeah.
Well, his ship would be attacked by pirates or a privateer and things like that. And so some days his flag was up, and some days it was down. You know, so. But he eventually dies on that trip from a thrombosis from the wound in his thigh. Yeah, that's what eventually kills him.
Now, what about the beginning, like before the Battle of Bladensburg? And you mentioned that he had to scuttle his flotilla right before. Yeah.
Before that, he was a privateer.
Yeah. He was a privateer.
Yeah, and he was trying to get the American Congress to build a navy. And the most he could get them to build were these barges.
Oh, so he actually pushed to have a navy.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people pushing. There was just no will. I think the Secretary of Defense at that time was Armstrong, and he didn't believe, he didn't believe that the British would attack. He says, "Oh no, they're not going to attack Washington." That's one of the reasons everything was so poorly done. They chased them. They told the militia to go home out of Washington. The Washington militia was told to leave, and they were so angry because they would have defended themselves. Okay, right. They would have defended their home. It was just a series of real bad decisions that led to the burning of Washington, and that's just another story. There are plenty of well-written books about that. Yeah, yeah.
So, anything else that you think that we should know about Joshua Barney? I mean, he sounds like an extremely heroic figure that he really should be taught about and heard about. And,
yeah.
But is there anything else that you feel like that hasn't been mentioned about him that we really should know?
Well, Barney also was a very prideful man. So when the Americans after the war failed to give him any recognition for his rank, he and the French invited him to become a Commodore. He took advantage of that situation, okay, because he was very proud of, in a sense, of what he had accomplished, and he thought he was worth more than the Americans were willing to give him. And he also promoted men in front of him that he felt that he should have been. So if there was a weakness in Barney, okay, it was his pride, okay. But at the other hand, he was a very generous person. When he escaped from Portsmouth prison, he was helped by a guard, by a British guard, and he was helped by a British minister, and he was helped by a British gardener, okay? And he remembered all these people. And when he got back to Britain after the war, he visited them, and in the case of the gardener and his son, they were, at that point, he was no longer serving in the military. You know, he was very generous with them. I mean, he gave them, and they were just common folk, you know. And yeah, so he was a really decent man, okay. But if there was a weakness, it was his pride. Okay.
All right. Well, just a little bit more, not necessarily about Barney, but you're wearing what looks like period piece clothing.
Yeah, this is
if you could talk about this.
Yeah, this was common. These type of breeches with the buttons and the suspenders were military, and also common for every day. This was not unusual. This is what I'm wearing right now.
Now, why are you dressed like this?
Well, I'm dressed like this to tell the story of what happened. Tell the story of late 18th century and early 19th century America, and to tell about the Battle of Bladensburg. The militia at the Battle of Bladensburg were composed of common folk who were obligated to be part of the militia. They were poorly trained. They met once a month, and the British could fire 3 rounds out of this thing in a minute. You know, the Americans are lucky if they get one off in a minute. Okay, it's just we were hunters.
Right.
And if a militiaman didn't have a musket, now this is smoothbore. Okay. When you load this thing and you drop the ball down, and even with the paper, it goes down very easy. If you were a militiaman and you didn't have a musket, then you had your own rifle. Well, that was a different story how to load that, and it took longer. It took much longer to load a rifle, simply because you had grooves in here, and you had to actually start the ball down, push it, and then the ramrod and push it down. It was not a convenient weapon for military. Okay. It was great for hunting because it was accurate. Okay. But it wasn't good. Now at New Orleans, that's what you had all these riflemen, okay, and they were dead shots. So see, when you fired this thing, and it was you didn't. There is a sight on this, okay. The bayonet fits over here on this piece right here. Our bayonet is a genuine bayonet, and this is a reproduction, and it doesn't fit on here. Okay, but when you fired this, once you got 50 feet away, you couldn't hit anything you were aiming at.
Wow.
Okay, the ball could go anywhere. Okay, so what you did is you had a whole bunch of guys standing together, aiming at the other guy standing together, and you tried to aim low enough so that you hit something. And it was, even in the Civil War, it was common. It's really interesting. The human nature doesn't want to kill. And so people, especially new soldiers, their major problem was they would shoot too high.
Really?
Yeah. And they were always told, aim low, aim low, aim low, because the natural tendency was to shoot over their heads.
Now, I know we're laughing because it's kind of like almost absurd to think about, but man, it's got to take some guts to be able to stand there in a line.
I know, I can't imagine it.
And then see the other line and just know that you're going to open fire and they're going to do the same exact thing right back at you.
The stupidity of it is beyond my, I don't understand that at all.
Exactly.
So, I was just watching the movie The Patriot, and that's exactly what they did there.
They did that,
yeah, that's what they do.
And it's kind of interesting that you dress like this. Do you feel it pulls people in and gets people more interested?
Yeah, if you can talk about what it was like and demonstrate different things, what people did, and it gets their interest, especially children, because you can't just talk to them. You've got to show them something.